The most serious readily provable offenses in cases where mandatory minimums are present because it's not warranted.
Distribution of 10 to 40 million of these braces and the implementation of your rule. Did Congress pass a law?
Who are prepared and carry a gun oftentimes have to make split-second decisions.
New law regarding pistol braces. It's actually a ruling because the ATF does not have the authority.
Details of the law, but folks, listen at home. Here's a quick summary of what this law is doing. It's already allowing.
They're going to get these. They're going to be a regulation, and it ain't going to change a damn thing. It's not going to stop.
The ATF has so recently released a new rule that aims to outlaw the selling of weapons by private parties. ATF lacks oversight of gun dealers, a culture of impunity. Uncle Sam's Loans, a pawn shop in Man, West Virginia, was the backbone of a sprawling gun trafficking scheme. According to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, ATF, the ATF's third inspection of the store in 7 years found that the store had transferred weapons without conducting background checks and failed to provide safety notices to handgun buyers. At one point, ATF records show more than 600 firearms that should have been in stock could not be found, a red flag or gun trafficking. In both cases, the violations were serious enough to warrant stripping Uncle Sam's of its license to sell guns. However, agency officials decided to spare the shop, issue an official warning to its owners, and give them another chance to prove they could follow the rules. As the investigator leafed through handwritten ledgers in the spring of 2014, she discovered that things had hardly improved. Sales records were incomplete, the stores failed to report required information to law enforcement, and safety notices still weren't going out. The inspector typed out her findings and sent them to her superiors. They decided to issue yet another warning. Months later, the ATF learned that Uncle Sam's was the backbone of a sprawling gun trafficking scheme. Witnesses told the agency that Stephen Adkins, a longtime shop employee who had purchased a stake in the business, had enlisted a host of people, including a colleague's girlfriend and his brother-in-law, to falsify paperwork so it would appear they had purchased guns in legitimate transactions. In reality, the guns were used to bribe coal officials in a pay-to-play scheme at a local mine. Others were sold on the black market, witnesses said. Adkins pleaded guilty to aiding and abetting a false statement relating to purchases of more than 50 firearms from late 2008 to August 2014. He was sentenced to 10 months in prison. No one else was convicted in the trafficking scheme. The Trace in USA Today found that the federal agency in charge of policing the gun industry has been largely toothless and conciliatory, bending over backwards to go easy on wayward dealers such as Uncle Sam's and sometimes allowing guns to flow into the hands of criminals. Gun industry lobbyists have fought for decades against tougher oversight by casting gun dealers as among the most heavily regulated businesses in the USA. The Trace in USA Today's review found that dealers are largely immune from serious punishment and enjoy layers of protection unavailable to most other industries. The ATF has been investigating the issue of gun shop violations, which have led to a culture of impunity and a lack of enforcement. The agency provided Brady with roughly 2,000 reports from inspections that resulted in warning letters, warning conferences, and license revocations over the 2-year span from July 2015 through June 2017. However, annual fact sheets published by the ATF include aggregate figures showing the agency issued nearly twice as many penalties during fiscal years 2016 and 2017, a period that overlaps with the Brady documents.
Weim says the Missouri law exposes people to greater harm by interfering with the federal government's ability to enforce firearms regulations.
She proves you can run for office ending gun violence in the South and you can win.
You specifically said that.
But I said...
What does mandatory mean?
I'm trying to say that...
Does it mean that prosecutors get a choice?
You can apply for the tax stamp and not pay the $200 fee. It's a one-time fee.
A single violation is enough to shutter a gun shop if ATF officials can prove that the store willfully broke federal regulations. In the vast majority of the cases analyzed by the Trace in USA Today, the ATF gave violators the lightest penalty available, a boilerplate warning letter reminding them that their compliance is crucial to reduce violent crimes and protect the public. The agency revoked a gun dealer's license in less than 3% of cases. Gun shop owners who violate the rules seem to understand they have little to fear. The lack of action has fostered a culture of impunity, with gun dealers knowing that nobody gets prosecuted, that nobody gets held accountable, and that sends the signal that they can fudge things a little more and get away with it. The problems extend high into the management ranks of the ATF. The Trace and USA Today's review found that the managers of the on-ground investigators routinely overrule recommendations to revoke licenses and order lesser punishments. Reporters identified 138 reports in which ATF officials acknowledged that a dealer's violation were severe enough for them to lose their licenses. The agency revoked 56 of those licenses, just over 40%. A majority were granted lesser penalties, ranging from temporary license suspensions to warning letters. In the reports, ATF officials justified backing off by citing the dealer's age, recent health problems, intention to retire, and, in one case, affluent clientele. Current and former ATF officials say that, like regulatory touch, is at least partly a reflection of congregational restrictions on the agency's enforcement powers. Some also say the ATF has increasingly adopted an industry-friendly approach to lessen the risk of a backlash that could lead to budget cuts or additional limits on its authority. The proliferation of gun retailers means there are bad apples in communities across America, ripe for targeting by criminals. The ATF's goal is to gain compliance, not punish, and the agency has been largely toothless and conciliatory in its efforts to address the issue. ATF struggles in policing gun dealers. The ATF is the primary defense against firearms leaking out of legal streams of commerce and into the black market. However, the agency's weakness have led to the creation of gun store inspection programs in Illinois, New Jersey, and other states. In Illinois, the ATF held warning conferences with first-class firearms in 2009 and 2013. After investigators discovered that the gun shop had failed to conduct background checks, kept sloppy or incomplete records, and illegally transferred weapons to out-of-state residents. The store went on to sell at least a dozen weapons to a trafficking ring suspected of smuggling hundreds of kilograms of cocaine into the US from Mexico. In 2015, the agency cited first-class firearms for 12 more violations, resulting in the store's license being revoked. One supervisor criticized the owner, Craig Bricko, for displaying an intentional disregard and plain indifference to regulatory requirements. Some current and former ATF officials defended the inspection program as an effective way of ensuring gun dealers obey the rules without driving them out of business for fleeting missteps and unintentional errors. Thomas Brandon, the Bureau's acting director from 2015 to 2019, portrayed the penalties as tools to guide dealers into correcting violations and ensure future compliance. The agency can revoke licenses only for willful violations, and supervisors consider the totality of the inspection and its unique circumstances to ensure consistent enforcement nationwide. Dealers are inspected once every 7 years. The ATF, responsible for policing 78,000 gun dealers, manufacturers, and importers in the US, employs over 700 investigators who perform unannounced compliance reviews. Between fiscal years 2010 and 2019, the agency visited 15% of dealers annually, resulting in a visit every 7 years. Of all the inspections during that decade, at least a third, 35,500, found dealers had broken state or federal firearms laws. More than 81% of violators received no penalty or written warning. The ATF sought revocation of only 580 violators, or 1.6%. In the 2020 fiscal year, as the coronavirus pandemic snarled government operations, the ATF inspected only 5,827 licensed dealers, or 7.5%, the lowest annual inspection rate since 2004.
We can expect in the future that more people will be carrying handguns on the streets in places like Los Angeles, Boston, and New York City.
ATF agreed to, in 2012, should not be under the jurisdiction of your rule?
Since you rewrote the rules of asylum based on the perceived degree of violence in these countries.
What changed is that item that was submitted was not produced and was not the item that was marketed.
More than 2,400 of those dealers were found to have committed violations. and 40 dealers had their licenses revoked. The most common violations cited by the ATF were for gun sellers failing to acquire customers' personal details, omitting information required on federal forms, and not keeping proper inventory and sales records. Former ATF official and gun dealers said such violations are usually innocent mistakes stemming from labyrinthine rules governing gun sales. However, even seemingly minor paperwork errors can indicate a dealer's involvement in more serious forms of law breaking or stymie law enforcement investigations into major crimes. Gun groups have successfully pressured Congress to limit the frequency of inspections, restrict ATF from consolidating and computerizing records, and make it more difficult for the agency to take dealers' licenses away. The number of gun dealers' inspection dropped from an average of nearly 12,000 inspections a year in the 1990s to less than 7,000 a year in the 2000s. Former ATF supervisor Howard Wolf said the investigators under his command would need to have visited multiple gun shops every day to meet the ATF's inspection goals. Federal law mandates gun dealers to report multiple handgun sales to the same purchaser within 5 days. Brown, a gun dealer, was cited for facilitating a straw sale, an illegal sale where someone other than the gun's recipient filled out the background check paperwork. The ATF investigator who led the inspection recommended that the agency should revoke Brown's firearm license. A supervisor agreed that the violations met the threshold for revocation, but recommended downgrading the penalty to a warning conference without providing an explanation. The director of industry operations for the ATF Seattle Field Division agreed with the lesser penalty. The Trace and USA Today reviewed dozens of other cases in which the ATF let gun dealers remain in business after meeting the criteria for revocation. ATF records indicate that Guns West 2 has since gone out of business. ATF investigators spent an average of 84 hours on each of the inspections examined by the Trace and USA Today. One particularly taxing case in Houston took 995 hours, the equivalent of half a year of workdays. The investigator recommended revoking the license but was rebuffed by the industry operations director. In another case in Kansas, a pawn shop transferred an AK-47 type rifle and a Glock to a woman acquiring the weapons on behalf of her boyfriend, a convicted felon, court records indicate. In February 2016, a former senior ATF attorney who went into private practice helping gun industry clients comply with the law said limited resources had led the Bureau to focus on inspecting dealers who sell large numbers of crime guns, frequently transfer large quantities of firearms to a single customer, or raise other red flags. Berettas said that this was a poor substitute for regular inspections and could embolden dealers willing to break the law. ATF rules restricting ghost guns for now. Justice Samuel Alito prolonged his temporary halt of a lower court decision that invalidated the Biden administration's ban on so-called ghost guns, allowing implementation of a rule from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives to go ahead for the time being. Alito issued a brief ruling extending a 4-day administrative stay that was scheduled to conclude at 5 p.m. on August 4 until 5 p.m. on August 8. Alito deals with emergency relief requests coming from a collection of states, among them Texas, where the argument against the ATF's attempts to regulate phantom weapons first surfaced. Late last month, the Biden administration petitioned the Supreme Court for emergency relief and requested that the court stay a decision from a federal district court in Texas that had invalidated the law governing ghost weapons. The Gun Control Act definition of a firearm was changed as a result of the ATF's action, which became effective in August 2022. The goal was to address the rise in ghost guns, untraceable firearms that may be made from online kits and assembled at home. The definition of a firearm under the regulation said that it includes a weapon parts kit that is designed to or may readily be completed, assembled, restored, or otherwise converted to expel a projectile by the action of an explosive. A partially complete, disassembled, or non-functional frame or receiver, including a frame or receiver parts kit that can be made functional, is now included in the definition of frames or receivers, which are also supplied in kits. manufacturers and marketers of specific kits are required by the law, as it is understood by the new rule to obtain licenses, serialize their products, conduct background checks, and keep records to enable law enforcement to track down the firearms when they are used in crimes. The rule does not forbid anyone who is legally permitted to own a handgun from buying, selling, or possessing one. It also does not prevent somebody from constructing a firearm at home. Last year, 2 gun owners, 2 advocacy groups, and companies that produce or sell the products covered by the rule filed a lawsuit against the ATF.
Who showed up here said one thing that felt good about doing this kind of event was that they felt empowered.
There's many of you out there, either parents, relatives, and/or victims yourself.
Some months later, during an ATF audit, I was told the background check was now a non-approval.
Holding it a certain way, it'll continue to bump back and forth against my trigger finger.
ATF's proposed rule on firearms business definition. According to a news release issued by the ATS on this topic, the Attorney General signed the ATF's Notice of Proposed Rulemaking 2022 R-17 definition of engaged in the business as a dealer in firearms on the 30th of August 2023. The following is an excerpt from a news release issued by the ATF. The proposed rule proposes to incorporate the bipartisan Safer Communities Act definition of predominantly earn a profit. That was another element that they incorporated into the Safer Communities Act, which was passed by both parties. If you are selling firearms with a primary intention of making a profit, then you may be engaging in the illegal activity of dealing firearms. To put it another way, if you make any kind of profit at all, you can expect them to come after you and demand that you comply with their demands. They are suggesting that maybe you are an auctioneer. This wouldn't touch you. And maybe if you're buying and selling from personal collections, then maybe this wouldn't affect you. Additionally, they are stating that maybe this wouldn't affect you if you were buying and selling from other people's collections. Now, we are going to talk about that a little bit later because there is some problematic language in this proposed regulation that muddles the issue. This is going to be discussed a little bit later. When purchasing firearms for a personal collection and then selling those firearms, a person is not considered to be engaged in a business of dealing in firearms as it is stated in the provision. It is fascinating to consider how open to interpretation and far-reaching this guideline really is. It states that basically this proposed rule is announced and that the desire to primarily earn a profit does not require the individual to have obtained pecuniary advantage in order for there to be a possibility of a legal case being brought against them. They don't necessarily have to demonstrate your true objective, and they don't even necessarily have to show that you earn a profit or any real profit. So what they're arguing there is that they don't necessarily have to prove that you get a profit. Opposition to ATF's proposed rule on firearms business definition. Toy advocates, it is absolutely necessary for all of us to participate in the proposed rulemaking and express our disagreement with what the ATF is proposing to enact. It is interesting to note that when one investigates further into this rule, one discovers that the department has thought about but has not provided an alternative strategy. This alternative proposal would have established a minimum numerical limitation for the number of firearms that can be sold by an individual within a given time period. When we first learned about this rule, one of the most important questions that arose was the following. Would there be a specific amount of gun transactions that trigger the demand for an FFL license? The answer has been provided. The ATF wishes to make it clear that they will not be establishing a particular numerical threshold for these types of transactions. They plan, as an alternative, to make use of a totally subjective test in order to decide when there is sufficient intent to call for the acquisition of an FFL license. According to the regulation, thus, even a single firearms transaction or offer to engage in a transaction when combined with other evidence may be sufficient to require a license. In effect, what they are saying is that even a single transaction involving a firearm has the potential to classify you as involved in the business of dealing firearms, which would necessitate the possession of an FFL license. This assertion is based on the overall circumstances as well as their own subjective evaluation. This exemplifies how controversial this new rule would be if it were implemented.
Because people buy hundreds of guns legally and then they sell them illegally.
In areas that are poor, mostly minority, there's a mass shooting.
when somebody bump fires, think of this as a bump fire stock and able to move.
The Attorney General himself, Ken Paxton, tweeted saying, quote, "What we just witnessed is illegal."
They go on to say that even under the earlier statutory definition, courts have upheld convictions for dealing without a license when few, if any, actual firearms were sold. This is something that they say happened even when there were no actual sales. This was conditional on the presence of other variables, such as the individual's intention to keep selling firearms in the foreseeable future. In addition, they address issues regarding individuals who may try to circumvent a predetermined number threshold by spreading out their sales over a period of time. The ATF has decided not to identify a minimum threshold quantity of firearms that must be bought or sold in order to close potential loopholes like these. Instead, they go with a criterion that is entirely based on personal preference. In addition, the rule proposes that a person will be presumed to be engaged in the business of dealing firearms if they buy, sell, or offer firearms for sale while representing the potential buyers or demonstrating a willingness and ability to purchase and sell additional firearms, unless there is reliable evidence to the contrary. This provision applies only if there is no evidence to the contrary. This standard focuses a lot on intent more than anything else. Last but not least, the proposed rule advises taking into consideration whether a person spends more money or its equivalent on the firearm purchases with the intention of reselling those firearms than the person's reportable taxable gross income during the relevant time period. The determination of whether or not a person needs an FFL license now includes a monetary assessment component as a result of this change. Instead of establishing a certain number threshold for transactions, the ATF's proposed rule on the definition of a gun's business focuses on a subjective criterion, intent-based criteria, and monetary evaluation. This is in contrast to the current rule, which sets a numerical threshold. It is of the utmost importance that we participate in this rulemaking process and make our concerns known regarding these changes that are being proposed. Broader implications of ATF's proposed rule. The fact that this rule is applicable to more than just standard monetary transactions is yet another fascinating facet of it. It is not limited to the transfer of cash alone, rather, the ATF is contending that any type of benefit, even if it entails bartering or exchanging firearms, could be sufficient to fall inside the rule's reach. This is not limited to the transfer of cash alone.
To do anything about what the president is doing to exercise that authority unconstitutionally, as was the case with student loans.
59 times, and then, harmed a bunch of other people, 500 and something.
And within less than 15 minutes, you can walk out the front door here with a rifle or a shotgun.
To be clear, this wasn't based on violence. This is based on threats specifically to individuals, on gangs.
This indicates that the requirement for compliance could potentially be triggered by any value received in exchange, regardless of the form that value takes. In addition, the law incorporates an intriguing nuance by taking into account firearms that are now new or like new condition and are still packaged in their original containers. The ATF cautions that even if you buy a firearm, store it carefully so that it stays in perfect condition, and keep its original packaging so that you can sell it later. You might still need a license from a federal firearms licensee, FFL, or have to go through an FFL to complete the necessary background checks and other procedures. With this brand new rule, the ATF is essentially striving to cover as many potential circumstances as they possibly can. And they are doing so by casting a wide net. This brief analysis sheds some light on the complexities of the rule, but a deeper dive into its workings is going to be required if one is to completely comprehend the repercussions of adhering to it. It is critical that you, the viewer, have a solid understanding of how this regulation may have an effect on you. In light of the fact that this matter is both subjective and multifaceted, the ATF made a conscious decision not to designate a particular amount of business dealings. Instead, they rely on intent, which suggests that even a single gun transaction, along with an individual's intent, might place them under the rule's jurisdiction. This is because they believe that intent is more difficult to falsify than actions. In these circumstances, getting a license to transfer firearms between private parties becomes obligatory, and failure to do so may result in severe criminal penalties. the possibility that you will be required to get an FFL license, submit to background checks, and successfully traverse related processes in order to conduct transactions with private parties is one of the most serious ramifications for you. This is comparable to the procedures that are already in place in states like California, and the ATF's goal with this proposed rule is to establish a nationwide framework for universal background checks. If this rule is enacted, it will effectively make it mandatory to either use an FFL license or acquire one in order to engage in the types of firearm transactions described above.
And that's it for this video, folks. We'll see you next time at the next video.